Hello, everyone, and welcome to Registrar Corp's webinar entitled US FDA Preventive Controls Requirements. My name is Jonathan Rhodes, a marketing specialist at Registrar Corp and today's moderator. This presentation will conclude with a live questions and answers session. If we run out of time, we are also happy to respond to your questions by email. You may submit a written question anytime during the webinar by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. A recorded copy of this presentation will be sent to all registrants. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Fabiola Negron holds a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Microbiology and pursued graduate coursework in Food Science and Technology at the University of Puerto Rico. She has successfully completed food safety training in good manufacturing practice and sanitation standard operation procedure, preventive controls for human foods, seafood and juice HACCP, foreign supplier verification programs, and others. Ms. Negron acts as Registrar Corp's Manager of Food Safety. She and her team assists food facilities to comply with US FDA food safety regulations by reviewing HACCP and HARPC food safety plans, developing foreign supplier verification programs, and more. They also offer services to act as qualified individual for FSVP importers. I'd like to go ahead and begin. Fabiola?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. As Jonathan mentioned, we're going to be speaking about the US FDA preventive controls requirements. First of all, we'll just go over the FSMA rules, then we'll jump into the preventive controls rules specifically and the components that make up a food safety plan. Then we will cover FDA's enforcement up to date, and we'll discuss top preventive controls violations in the past 2 years and the consequences of non-compliance. Then we'll go over the compliance dates and our questions session. So the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in 2011 by former President Obama. After that, in 2015, the month of September, the Preventive Controls Rule for Human Food and Animal Food was finalized. After that, in the month of November, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program and Third-Party Verification and Product Safety was also coming into effect. By April 6th, the Sanitary Transportation Act for the transportation of food was also finalized. And by May of 2016, the Intentional Adulteration or Food Defense Rule was finalized. On November, the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, so that importers could fast-track their imports through the U.S. port of entry, was also finalized. So we will begin with the Preventive Controls Rule for Human and Animal Food. It applies to FDA-registered food facilities, both foreign and domestic. It applies to human and animal feed, and it is called the Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Controls. It also includes food additives, GRAS substances, and dietary ingredients, not to be confused with dietary supplements. Exempt from this regulation are retail establishments like restaurants and stores, juice and seafood, which are subject to HACCP regulations, alcoholic beverages, dietary supplements, which are subject to the Dietary Supplement CGMPs in 21 CFR 111, farms, storage of packaged food that is not exposed to the environment, and USDA-regulated products like meat, poultry, and egg products. The preventive controls components include a hazard analysis, preventive controls, developing a supply chain program, conducting verification, having monitoring procedures, having written corrective actions, record keeping, and when in the case that significant hazards are identified for a food, you must also have a recall plan. So now we will go into detail about each component. The food safety plan must be written by a preventive controls qualified individual. This is an individual who has successfully completed training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls, at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by FDA, or is otherwise qualified through job experience to develop and apply a food safety system. As I said, the food safety plan must be developed by the PCQI or its preparation overseen by the PCQI. A way to become a preventive controls qualified individual is by taking the FSPCA Preventive Controls course, which at the end you would receive a certificate as evidence of its completion. You must write a hazard analysis to identify and evaluate, based on experience, illness data, scientific reports, and other information, the foreseeable hazards for each type of food that you manufacture. So you would have to consider the biological, chemical, and physical hazards from receiving to storage of the finished food, the likelihood and the severity of the hazard if it were to occur, and you have to identify the hazards that require a preventive control. Similar food categories or processes can be grouped. You must ensure that you are considering those hazards that are likely to occur, and also for hazards that are related to the type of food but not necessarily are occurring at your facility, you would still have to justify why the hazard does not apply to your specific process. When conducting a hazard analysis, you must consider these factors like the formulation of the food, the design of your facility, the raw materials that you're using, your suppliers. You have to understand the transportation practices. Are you receiving refrigerated foods, or are you receiving shelf-stable raw materials? The manufacturing and processing procedures, packaging activities and labeling activities. Do you have allergens in your product that need to be labeled? Storage and distribution. Again, if it's stored refrigerated, frozen, or if it's shelf stable. The intended or reasonably foreseeable use by the consumer or other processing facilities. Sanitation, including employee hygiene. Employee hygiene is very important, especially when you are manufacturing ready-to-eat foods. And any other factors that are specific to your raw material or food. There could be weather-related issues for some certain crops or certain countries, and levels of natural toxins like mycotoxins in wheat and other. Then you would also have to have a hazard analysis that's specific to your facility and your product. Typically, there's no two exact hazard analysis. You must consider those factors specific to your facility and to your type of product. So then once you complete your hazard analysis, you must identify preventive controls for those hazards that are likely to occur. So these are risk-based measures to significantly minimize or prevent the food safety hazards. And they have to be consistent with scientific understanding of safe food manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding. So now FDA requires you to use this scientific data and use the data available and the history of the food to make the proper determinations. There are different types of preventive controls, but FDA allows some flexibility as to these that you can identify in your hazard analysis or in your food safety plan. So the general preventive controls include the process controls, which are the CCPs, or critical control points, the allergen controls, which apply only to human food, sanitation controls, and supply chain controls. And you can identify other preventive controls that you deem necessary and that are particular to your operation. So once you identify a preventive control, you must establish the monitoring procedures, the corrective action, and the type of verification that you will conduct. to ensure that the preventive control is working. So the monitoring procedures would include what, how, when, and who. What is being monitored? How is it being monitored? When is it being monitored, the frequency? And then who is conducting the activity? Who is responsible for doing the monitoring? Then the corrective actions are the steps taken when a preventive control is not adequately implemented. This means that you must foresee which problems are likely to occur in your preventive control, and then you must list the corrective actions that the employees or that the quality control or managers are to take when those preventive controls are not working. You must conduct verification, which includes the validation of the process within 90 days of beginning to manufacture that food. Document the review to ensure that preventive controls and the monitoring and corrective actions are implemented and are effective. And you must reanalyze your food safety plan at least every 3 years. So in the verification, you're going to decide what type of activities will ensure that your preventive controls are working. So you could choose to perform, in case of a metal detector, you're going to verify the efficacy of the metal detection by using the metal strips every hour or every 2 hours. You're going to see the efficacy of the metal detector. Or you can choose to do sampling and testing of a food to ensure that the cooking process was adequate and that the bacteria were controlled. Those are types of verification. I mentioned that you have to develop a supply chain program. So a supply chain program is required when there is a hazard that will be controlled by your supplier previous to you receiving the food. So for raw materials or ingredients for which your supplier controls a significant hazard, you would have to develop a supply chain program. The requirements include you must evaluate the supplier for approval. So you must ensure that your supplier's practices and processes are adequate to control the hazard. You must establish written procedures for receiving and use of approved suppliers. So by having a list of your approved suppliers, let's say your warehouse employee can ensure that the food they receive is from the approved supplier. And you also could include within the receiving a verification step to ensure that the food is safe and that the control applied by your supplier, was effective. So you could conduct periodic sampling and testing, or you could do it for every lot. You could review their food safety records for those preventive controls, and you could conduct annual on-site audits to make sure that their facility and that their food safety practices are adequate. When a significant hazard is identified for your food, you must have a recall plan. These are written procedures that describe the steps to be taken and to assign responsibility for taking those steps to perform the following actions: to notify your consignees of the food being recalled, how to return the food, how are they supposed to dispose of it. This tells them, to separate that food and no longer distribute it further. To notify the public, as applicable, about any hazard that's presented by the food to protect public health. So if the food has reached the consumers, it is appropriate to notify the public so they may return the food or dispose of the food so they don't get sick. You must conduct effectiveness checks to verify that the recall is carried out appropriately, and you must dispose of the recall food through either reprocessing, reworking, diverting to a use that does not present a food safety concern, or destroying the food. So the recall plan would assign responsibilities to the people. It is important to have a recall plan in place so that in the event of a recall, you are prepared and you act very quickly. Then record keeping. Record keeping is very important because if you don't have records of the activities that you've conducted, it's like it never happened. So you must ensure that you keep records related to the preventive controls. You must have that written hazard analysis. You must have the supporting documents available. And the food safety plan must be signed by the owner, operator, or agent in charge. This proves the commitment of upper management to the food safety system. So anytime there is change in your food safety plan or any modification, it must be signed again. And the records related to the food safety plan must be accurate, indelible, and legible. They must be signed, dated, and properly identified. It must be kept for at least 2 years, and they are subject to FDA review. FDA can request these documents at any time if they, see that it could become a potential food safety hazard, or during a routine inspection. They once you register with FDA, you are saying to FDA that they are able to review your food safety system. So if you are familiar with what a HACCP plan is, you recognize most of these terms that I've gone over today. So we would like to just say what are a couple of differences between a HACCP plan and a HARPC or food safety plan under the Preventive Controls rule. So when we talk about a hazard analysis, a HACCP plan identifies biological, chemical, and physical hazards. And in a food safety plan, the chemical hazards are more specific, in which they include radiological and economically motivated adulteration. So you must consider those in your food safety plan. In regards to preventive controls, a HACCP plan only identifies the CCPs or the process controls, and things like a supply chain program, a recall plan, those are considered like prerequisite programs, or other things might be controlled under GMPs. But in the case of a food safety plan, it includes more than just the CCPs, and it includes the supply chain controls, the sanitation controls, allergen controls. They require like allergen hazards to be controlled under a preventive control. When we talk about parameters and values, a HACCP plan only focuses on the critical limits at the CCPs. However, in a food safety plan, the parameters also include minimum or maximum values equivalent to critical limits for process controls, and they include other more flexible controls as appropriate to what you are monitoring. Then the monitoring element was only required for the CCPs under the HACCP plan, but in the food safety plan, they are also more flexible and required as appropriate for the preventive controls. There might be some preventive controls that don't require a more stringent monitoring. Then we have the corrective actions and corrections. In a HACCP plan, you only had corrective actions. But in the food safety plan, you might also have a simple correction to fix a parameter, and it doesn't necessarily have to go into a list of corrective actions. A simple correction can fix it. An example is sanitation controls. If you are making your solutions, your disinfecting solution, you don't have to do a corrective action if that solution is not the proper concentration. You just make a correction, you add more of the solution or you add more water, however it is, to make that parameter adequate, and you do not need to go through a whole list of corrective actions. Also, in verification, in a HACCP plan is also just for the process controls. However, verification is as appropriate for all preventive controls, for the validation of the process controls, the supplier verification, and others. In regard to record keeping, In the HACCP plan, also only for process controls. However, in the food safety plan, all preventive controls need to be documented, and other activities that also support the implementation of the food safety plan must also be kept. And the recall plan is not required under a HACCP plan, but it is part of the preventive controls in a food safety plan. So we see there are some differences, and the HARPC plan or food safety plan is more detailed and includes more controls for the safety of food. There are some modified requirements under the preventive controls rule. For example, the low acid canned foods do not need to address biological hazards in a food safety plan because they are already covered under the regulation of low acid canned foods. So if you are preparing a food that is subject to that regulation, you would not have to include biological hazards or address them in the food safety plan. However, FDA will expect you to have a scheduled process, to have your SIDs for those canned foods, to register as a food canning establishment. You do have to meet those other requirements, though they are not included in the food safety plan. And we do have some people that still, or some clients that still included in the food safety plan. So we leave that up to you, but you're not required to do so if you are following the 21 CFR 113. Then also storage of packaged food that requires refrigeration for safety. So we mentioned before that foods that are stored and are not exposed to the environment do not need a food safety plan. They're not subject to preventive controls. However, if the food requires refrigeration for safety, then FDA expects you to have controls for those temperature controls in place. You do not need to have an extensive food safety plan for other hazards. However, you would have to have temperatures controlled to ensure the temperatures are kept for those refrigerated foods. And then qualified facilities. These are facilities that are very small, and FDA does provide some exemptions. You would not have to have a food safety plan or a supply chain program, and we'll go into more detail on those. So a qualified facility are very small business or other facilities to which those apply, and I will go through each. So a very small business is those businesses that average over the preceding 3 years in global sales and market value of any food manufactured, processed, packed, or held without sale, and including any subsidiaries and affiliates, those that make less than 1 million in human food, or in the case of animal food is less than 2.5 million. So you would have to calculate what is your average in the preceding 3 years for all your food, not only those that are coming to the United States, it's globally. And if it's less than 1 million, you are considered a qualified facility, or if it's less than 2.5 million for animal food. Then also other facilities to which these apply, which is the average of the preceding 3 years as well. The market value of any food manufactured, processed, packed, or held, and this is the difference, that is sold directly to qualified end users. And a qualified end user is like a restaurant or the consumer. So if your facility would make, more than $1 million in human food, but it is sold mainly to the consumer or to restaurants locally, then FDA would allow that exemption. And it also including all subsidiaries and affiliates. And in that food, you would have to make less than $500,000. And again, it's just for the food sold directly to qualified end users that must exceed the sales to any other purchaser. So if the food sold to any other purchaser is less than 500,000, then you are qualified or eligible for this qualified facility attestation. And to be eligible, also, you would have to submit that attestation to FDA. You can't be considered a qualified facility if you have not submitted that to FDA. So even if you're a small business and FDA visits you, they say, oh, you have not submitted this documentation, so we cannot consider you as a qualified facility, and all the requirements of a food safety plan would apply to you. So you must ensure that you submit the documentation to FDA. So it would be the Form 3942A for human food, or the Form 3942B in the case of animal food. And FDA evaluates your evidence, which includes calculations and tax information, of your income and your sales and market value of the food. And then if it's approved, you would be exempt from the from the food safety plan and supply chain program requirements. You would have to resubmit this attestation every 2 years during the registration process with FDA. So now we'll go over the enforcement of the preventive controls. So these were the top 5 food safety plan violations in the past 2 fiscal years of 2019 and 2020. As you would see, they are basically the same violations, just in different order. So the first one is the hazard analysis did not identify a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard that required a preventive control. And this happens a lot. FDA has provided guidance on the hazards that are related to a particular food or process. And they expect they have used their own data to come up with this guidance. So it is important that when you conduct your hazard analysis, you also consider what FDA expects to be a hazard in your food. And then in your hazard analysis, you can determine whether or not it's significant in your particular operation. But you must have a strong justification as to why a hazard is not applicable in your process. Then the second one is you did not have a written food safety plan. This also happens quite often. You must have a written food safety plan, and it must be complete. It must have all of the components. You did not establish and or implement adequate written sanitation controls verification procedures for product testing or environmental monitoring. This applies to the ready-to-eat foods. If you have a food that is ready to eat and it is exposed to the environment after a kill step has been applied, FDA expects you to have sanitation controls and environmental monitoring in place to ensure that the environmental pathogens like Salmonella and Listeria are not present in your food. Then you did not identify a preventive control for a hazard when one was needed as well. If you have a hazard that has been identified or a hazard that you did not identify but FDA considers to be significant in your process, then they would provide that observation during inspection. Number 5, you did not establish and or implement adequate written procedures for monitoring sanitation controls. So this is where those HACCP versus HARPC differences come into play, because in a HACCP plan, you do not necessarily have to include written procedures for sanitation controls. However, in a food safety plan, it is part of your plan. It's not a prerequisite program or some other type of supporting part of your food safety system. So FDA is requiring that when sanitation controls are needed in the case of to prevent allergen cross contact or to prevent the contamination with environmental pathogens, you must have those written sanitation controls. And the ones on the right column, as I mentioned, are the same observations, just in different order. So this would be a good start to focus when you're writing your food safety plan. So when FDA finds non-compliance, they might go to your facility, conduct an inspection, and they would submit a Form 483. And those are inspectional observations. So they would provide you with 15 days to reply to a Form 483. And if you do not contact them in time, they may issue a warning letter. And warning letters, and they're available for the public to see. So it is important that once you receive your Form 483, you immediately begin your corrective actions and submit those corrective actions to FDA to prevent a warning letter. Now, in the cases where there is a very significant noncompliance that is hazardous to the public, they may issue a warning letter directly instead of going through the Form 483. And also, they might request for you to conduct a recall if the product, is a food safety hazard and has been distributed. Then there's also detentions and refusals at the port of entry. So FDA does routine sampling and testing at the port for the significant hazards related to the particular foods. So, they might detain your shipment until you prove compliance, or they might refuse it. Also, if you've been constantly detained at the port, they might issue an import alert. They might put you on the import alert list, and this means that you cannot import that food to the United States anymore, and it will not be subject to detention for examination. They will just refuse it without checking it. Even if it's compliant, it will not come into the country. So it is important that if you're placed on import alert, that you do what is necessary to get off that import alert, and get compliant. So if there's also a pattern of non-compliance, FDA might suspend your registration, and this means you cannot import anything to the United States. So in the case of import alert, FDA is specific to the company and the type of food, but with a suspension of registration, you would not be able to export anything to the United States. Whatever is under your company name is not going to make it into the United States. Then seizures and injunctions, they could do civil and criminal charges where applicable, and as well, this non-compliance is, since it's made to the public, like the warning letters, recalls, detentions and refusals, the import alert, those are all available online. That data is available to the public in general. So, that's a big impact to your company image as well. And in regards to the compliance dates, they've all passed for preventive controls and food safety plan requirements. So the compliance dates began in September 16th of 2016 for the larger facilities or companies, and it ended this past January 26th with some requirements for animal feed operations. So depending on the size of the company and the type of operation, FDA had, different types of compliance dates, but by now they have all passed. Everybody is expected to be compliant with the food safety plan requirements. And if you're a qualified facility, please make sure that you submit your attestation so you are eligible for those exemptions. If you want to see other FSMA compliance dates, you can visit the link. They have the compliance dates for FSBP or Transportation Act. So they have all those different types of compliance dates in that link.
Thank you, Fabiola, for that great presentation. So before we move into our questions and answer session, I would like to address just some of the ways that Registrar Corp can help with this FSMA compliance. So fortunately, Registrar Corp can assist with all of the regulations that FDA discussed today. Fabiola discussed today. Fabiola and her team are Preventive Controls qualified individuals who spend their time developing food safety plans, writing HACCP plans, and developing foreign supplier verification programs as well. So as part of Registrar Corp's Food Safety Plan development service, Fabiola and her team can review your existing food safety plan for FDA compliance. So that might involve an existing HACCP plan that you might have. They can review that and see how it can fit into the FDA preventive controls requirements. And they can actually just review any food safety documentation you have to build it up into a compliant FDA food safety plan. This service includes a complete review of your food safety documentation, a compliant food safety plan for your facility, a one-on-one expert assistance with a member of Fabiola's team, and a revision of the same HARPC plan within 30 days. And so if you go ahead and contact us for assistance and you're interested in this service, you can simply mention this webinar and you'll receive a 10% discount on this service. Additionally, Registrar Corp offers the only 100% online FSPCA Preventive Controls training. So from the comfort of your home, you can take Registrar Corp's Preventive Controls Qualified Individual training from your computer, and you can become a Preventive Controls Qualified Individual, complete with a certificate from the FSPCA. So this course involves learning to conduct a hazard analysis, applying preventive controls, and maintaining the documentation that's required under FSMA. And just as with the other service, you can receive a 10% discount on this course simply by checking out with the promo code webinar10. The link is not published on the screen, but if you write this down, registrarcorp.com/PCQI, it will take you to a page where you can learn more about the course, add it to your cart, and use the promo code to receive the 10% discount. This training is also available in Spanish, and we are currently working to get that Spanish training approved by FSPCA as well. So again, I would like to announce that we will be sending a recorded copy of this webinar and a PDF copy of the presentation to all of our registrants. During this time, you may submit a written question by using the Ask a Question feature in the top center of your webinar screen. I'm going to go ahead and display our contact information up here as well. So if you have any questions that we're unable to get to today, our contact information is available on the screen, as well as the information for our 20 offices worldwide who can provide regional and multilingual support. So our first question: we manufacture dietary supplements. Do we need to develop a food safety plan for each product? Do we need to have a PCQI in our company?
Thank you for your question. Dietary supplements is not subject to the Preventive Controls rule. They are subject to CGMPs for dietary supplements in 21 CFR 111. So you do not need to have a food safety plan for your dietary supplements. However, if you also manufacture dietary ingredients, the dietary ingredients that will be further processed into dietary supplements, those dietary ingredients would need to be manufactured under preventive controls. But if it's a finished dietary supplement, what you're manufacturing, you would have to comply with the CGMPs for dietary supplements.
Excellent. Our next question: should we test our recall plan when we're conducting our recall plan?
So when you develop a recall plan, it is important to test it or do a mock recall, as they call it, to ensure that it is effective, that you are able to contact the persons that you're trying to notify of a recall. So it is important to do those test runs to make sure that it is effective, it is made quick, and that everybody understands their role in a recall event.
And so another question that's slightly below that kind of touches upon that same topic: please kindly advise about parameters to measure effectiveness of a mock recall. Is it a measure by time?
Well, FDA does not specifically mention a time, but it is very recommended that within 24 hours you are able to contact all of your consignees. So it is important to first be able to identify where the food is, or even further, once you receive a complaint or you notice that through testing that the food had a food safety hazard, you're going to have to be able to determine where that food is. So which lots were affected. You have to move fast. So once you alert your recall team of the need for a recall, you must work fast to ensure that you find that food, that you find who has purchased that food, where it is. Is it still in the warehouse? Did I sell it to my customer? Has it reached the consumer? So it is important that within 24 hours, you've found that food and you've notified your consignees of the hazard related to the food.
Thanks, Fabiola. Our next question, if you do not have any critical control points, would you have any preventive controls?
That's a good question. Well, as I mentioned, critical control points are only process controls. So in this case, it's possible that you don't have any CCPs, but that you could have a supply chain program in place if your supplier is controlling the hazards for you, or it is possible that if you're simply, receiving a bulk product and putting it in smaller containers for a retail sale, that you would have sanitation controls in place to prevent contamination. So if you don't have any CCPs, it's possible that other preventive controls may apply.
Thank you, Fabiola. Our next question, for Forms 3942A and 3942B, Qualified Facility Attestation, does it have to be submitted every 2 years from the date of the first submission, or every even numbered years as for the biennial renewal?
It has to be during the biennial renewal.
Excellent. Thank you, Fabiola. Our next question, what is the best source to identify the hazards that are specific to your type of food?
So there are different sources. If you're doing a food safety plan for compliance with FDA, I recommend to use the guidance provided by them. It is available on their website, and it lists for a variety of products and processes the most common hazards. However, you must also consider your own facility, your own country, your own processes and the design of your facility. So when you do those more general, common, or scientific, use that scientific evidence available out there, you still have to consider your own facility and, from the more general to the more specific.
Thank you, Fabiola. Our next question, products that are not necessarily foods but are going to be consumed by an animal, like a rawhide bone, do these need a food safety plan?
Yes.
If we are a qualified facility, then what documentation/program are we still required to have for FDA purposes?
So if you are a qualified facility, you would only need to comply with the GMPs. So in complying with having good manufacturing practices, you general sanitation controls, just manufacturing that food in a sanitary manner in accordance to the GMPs, that's the only requirement that you would have to comply with, and also submitting that attestation in the required every 2 years.
Thank you, Fabiola. Our next question is an interesting one. We are a food distribution company that has more than 50 products. Shall we register all products, or is just our company enough? So I think this might be referencing two separate requirements. So just to clarify, the FDA registration that we submit biennially is based on a facility that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds food for consumption in the United States. So in terms of registration, your facility is all you need to register. However, for your 50 products, Fabiola can go into a bit more detail about what you would need to do.
Yes, so when you register your facility, the FDA form that you need to fill out, you need to list the types of products that you manufacture. So if those 50 products are different products, let's say you have cookies and crackers or baked goods, those could be under baked goods, but you also do seafood, or you do juice, or you have to list those different product types in your registration. However, also in the case of the food safety plan, you would have to have a food safety plan for each type of food or process. And if it were seafood, well, you would need a HACCP plan. but you do not need to register products themselves. You register your facility and you let FDA know which products you are manufacturing in that facility.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question is a great question. Is FDA enforcement carried out on the importer or on the foreign manufacturer?
On both. So FDA is now, with the new regulation for importers, has even more accessibility to your operation, because through your importer, they can get a glance at what you are doing at your facility. So it's easier for them to inspect the importer, get those food safety documents that you have provided your importer, and see this foreign supplier is compliant, or this foreign supplier has many issues, and they can put your importer on import alert for accepting food from a foreign supplier that is not compliant, but they also can take action against you because you're not complying. So now they have two different ways to inspect the importer and the foreign supplier at the same time. And if they go to your facility and find out that you are not in compliance, they could also come back to your importer and say, why did you approve them? They're not compliant. So they can do it, they can take action against both at any time.
Okay, great. Next question. I'm seeing quite a few questions kind of surrounding, I'm exporting a particular product, for example, a gummy bear jelly candy, or I'm exporting cocoa beans to the United States. And the question surrounding these products is, do I need to develop a food safety plan? So I'm not sure if maybe, Fabiola, we can just reestablish who needs a food safety plan in this
So
respect.
if you are manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding food, with the exception of seafood juice or dietary supplements, you need a food safety plan. Or alcoholic beverages are also exempt. So gummy bears would need a food safety plan. Something like cocoa beans, there is an exemption for food that cannot be processed without a control. So cocoa beans and coffee beans are exempt from having a food safety plan, because your customer, if they roast the beans and grind the beans, after entry to the United States, you would not need to have a food safety plan. There are certain exemptions, because the food safety hazards would be controlled by your customer here in the United States.
Excellent. Our next question, companies that are certified under the IFS food standard or any other standards, do they need to have a food safety plan?
So being certified under certain food safety schemes does not guarantee that you have a compliant food safety plan. It depends on the scope of the certification. If the certification does not include FSMA, it's possible that there may be certain gaps within your food safety system that might not be compliant with FDA. So in the case that the certification is specific to their standards, and it also includes a separate module to consider requirements under FDA, then it's possible that that would suffice. But it's very important to make sure that there aren't any gaps within those certifications.
Our next question, we are producing a dehydrated pili nut. Do we need to establish a preventive control for every flavor we added, or just for the dehydrated pili nut only?
So you must consider raw materials, ingredients. That is part of your hazard analysis. You're going to analyze each type of product and each product separately. So if you have different flavors of pili nuts, then you would consider what ingredients go into flavor A, what ingredients go into flavor B, to make sure that you are considering the hazards related to each ingredient. So that's the importance of the hazard analysis. You must review each component that goes into your food and each process that is supplied to that food. So if the pili nuts in general, you're adding artificial flavors or something like that, it could be considered just under one food safety plan. But if it's very different processes between different types of food, then you would have to separately have a separate food safety plan for each product.
Is our prerequisite program also considered part of preventive controls?
So this is what goes into the difference between HACCP and HARPC. So under HACCP, there are certain components that under HARPC would be considered preventive control. So it is possible you already have these controls in place under a prerequisite program, but FDA wants you to identify them as a preventive control and make sure that the monitoring, the corrective actions, those preventive controls components of verification are conducted when the preventive control is not applied correctly. So if your prerequisite program is thorough, you could simply say, yes, this prerequisite program is also a preventive control. So you could, transfer that information like that. But if it's a prerequisite program that it's more loose, it does not have the components of who, what, when, and how, then I recommend you revise your food safety plan to make sure they do have the components necessary.
Okay. We have a secondary food packaging company. Do we need to establish a preventive control plan? So I believe the question is the food packing company, in addition to a manufacturing company, do we need two food safety plans?
So it depends on the food of your operation. Like if you're packaging food that is already received in their primary packaging and you're just repacking, well, repacking wouldn't necessarily mean, require a food safety plan. But if you're packing food that comes out of a primary packaging or is received in bulk, and excuse me, and you may have exposed that food to the environment at the facility, then it is recommended to have the sanitation controls in place, and you would need to have a food safety plan for that.
Excellent. Our next question, which is a great question, can you still be subjected to an FDA inspection if you have filed a qualified facility attestation?
Yes, FDA can still inspect. I do not think you would be at top of their priority list because qualified facilities, they're using that data to make sure that they target the large impact companies. The food will reach the most consumers or would be a most food safety risk. So if you're a qualified facility, I don't think you're at the top of their list, but at any moment they could inspect, and they've inspected qualified facilities before. And you would have to have your documentation ready to prove that you still comply with the qualified facility requirements. If they find out that you are making more than what you said, then they would expect you to have the food safety plan and they could take regulatory action against you.
Our next question, do I need to have all of my documentation translated into English, or is it okay if I have it written in Spanish?
So you may have your documentation in Spanish for, if you and your facility employees just speak Spanish. But FDA will request translation if they don't have an inspector that speaks Spanish. They will most likely require you to translate documents that you provide to them during inspection.
Is the food safety plan necessary for a non-ready-to-eat product manufacturing industry?
It depends. If there are certain chemical and physical hazards that you would still need to address in your hazard analysis. So a food safety plan would be necessary to address those. If it's something like pasta that will be boiled by the consumer, you would still need to make sure that other chemical or physical hazards are controlled within your process.
Thanks, Fabiola. Our next question, I think this is a good question to just reiterate and clarify. Do you have a food safety plan? Do you have to have a food safety plan and a HARPC plan, or do you choose one depending on your process?
So a food safety plan and HARPC plan would be the same thing. Like the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls is what requires you to have a food safety plan. That's the regulation and the plan. Now, the different plans are HACCP or HARPC. So HACCP is required for seafood and juice products, and a food safety plan is required for the other foods.
Excellent. If our products don't go to retail consumers in the US, do we need to have a preventive controls plan? We are a foreign exporter.
Yes, even if they don't go to the retail consumer, whatever food enters the United States has to be, has to have a food safety plan, depending that they don't fall under the exemptions, but every food must have a food safety plan.
Our next question is all of this necessary for loose leaf tea? If I wanted to import tea from a Chinese supplier to the US, would the supplier need to be compliant?
Yes, the foreign suppliers need to be compliant with the food safety plan, and you as an importer must have an FSBP that verifies their compliance with the preventive controls rule.
Our next question, who carries out FDA audits worldwide and are they accredited?
So the FDA inspections are conducted by FDA inspectors themselves. They travel abroad. If they have an agreement with the country, with the different types of countries, they might have the regulatory authorities from that country conduct inspections for them. They have certain agreements with different countries, so it depends. But mostly what I've seen is that the FDA inspectors travel from the United States to conduct these inspections.
Does the critical limit for a critical control point need to be measurable or can it be observable too? For example, based on a visual inspection?
So it depends on the type of control that you're applying. Yeah, I can't recall right now which one would be for visual inspection, but critical limits need to be, validated, and you need to have scientific understanding behind your type of preventive control and what you're monitoring. So it's important that if you are inspecting your food, well, actually, for visual observation, I just thought about it. Let's say you are packing something in glass jars. So one of your critical control points is the visual inspection of those glass jars to make sure they're not broken, that there's not glass around the equipment, just to make sure that there isn't any broken glass. That could be a critical control point that is visually observed. But mostly process control points are things that are measurable, like pH, or water activity, or a temperature. So it is important to make sure that whatever control you decide to conduct on your product, that it is scientifically based.
Excellent. I see two questions that are very, very similar, and I think that they're definitely worth exploring. And so the central idea behind the question is, do we need a separate document for our food safety plan, or can we use our HACCP plan, which we already have? Should we move from HACCP to HARPC to satisfy the FDA requirements?
So again, it depends. If your HACCP plan includes the components and has identified the correct controls, it really doesn't matter what you call it. The name is just a name, but if FDA inspects and sees that you have identified the proper controls, that you are monitoring your CCPs and monitoring your supply chain controls and your allergen controls, they will not, give you a bad observation because you did not call it a certain way. But it must be recorded and documented that you did perform the activity within, compliance with the HARPC requirements or the food safety plan requirements.
Okay. Our next question, do we not require HACCP for all food companies? So does the FDA require HACCP for all food companies?
Yeah, so the HACCP, again, is only for seafood and juice, and the HARPC or food safety plan would be for the other types of foods. I also saw a question that talked about dietary supplements for animals, and I would like to clarify that FDA does not consider animal supplements to be dietary supplements. So they're just considered as animal food. So you would still need a food safety plan for, supplements directed to animal feed.
Okay, great. We have a lot of great questions here, and we are running out of time, so are going to take our last question, and that is, are FDA inspections announced or are they unannounced?
So in the case of foreign inspections, they are announced because planning into the travel and lodging of that person during the time of inspection, it requires planning. So they will announce, they will send you a notice of inspection, and once you reply, that you've received that notice and you're welcoming FDA into your facility, they will then provide a specific date in which they plan to visit, and you say, yes, we're operating. And once you provide, they will provide you a form which has some questions for you to answer based on just confirming your type of operation, what products you manufacture, and just general facility information. And also it would have a section that you can recommend which airport is closer or any hotels near the area, so FDA can plan their stay in your close to your facility. So those are announced, but domestic inspections here in the United States, they are unannounced. So they might just show up at your door at any time.
Okay, so thank you for joining us today, everyone. We are out of time, but you can send us additional questions anytime by email to info@registrarcorp.com, which you can see on your screen. You can also email one of our 20 offices worldwide for regional and multilingual support. This concludes our presentation, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today.